I was going to be talking about energy by the numbers. Some of these numbers have come up already, but I just very quickly wanted to kind of reinforce them because it seems to me they are quite startling. First, really, just to say that the numbers are very, very big, and we talked a bit about the amount of oil the world uses, 100 million barrels a day. Somebody said about 90 million barrels every single day, which is a staggering number when you think about it. If you think that when we talk about finding a giant oil field, the kind of industry jargon is a giant oil field is more than 500 million barrels, so the world gets through that in a week. If you think about the BP oil spill, that was whatever it was, about 4 or 5 million barrels was spilled all those weeks that went on in the Gulf of Mexico. That's about the amount of oil that the world uses in a single hour. And so it is a huge, there is a huge volume of it produced and consumed in the world. We are utterly dependent on it. And so that's something that's very, very difficult to shift away from. Again, likewise, then when you think about renewables, people want to talk about renewables and wind and solar and the kind of things that Jeremy was talking about earlier. Tremendous growth from a very, very low base. Fossil fuels, if you add together gas, oil and coal, still about 80% of all the world's energy comes from those sources. Renewables are growing fast, but still only 13% of the world's energy comes from renewable power, renewable energy, and a big chunk of that is what's euphemistically called traditional biomass, which means burning wood and dung for fuel, which is a terrible thing to do. It has very serious health effects. Hundreds of thousands of people die every year from the effects of using that traditional biomass. And the kind of what you might think of as the kind of the good renewables, wind and solar power, within that they're only about 2% of the world's energy. And to get them to larger contributions requires an enormous amount of investment, and there's a huge amount of money that will need to be deployed. And again, we saw very interesting just seeing the amount of money and the importance of capital investment and profit to the oil industry. That's absolutely true of renewable energy as well. And I was looking at the International Energy Agency's got some numbers saying that to get from, I think it's a relatively modest shift. It's to get from 13% of the world's energy coming from renewables to 18% of the world's energy coming from renewables by 2035. That's $6.5 trillion of investment will be needed. And so, I mean, again, even in these days of post-great financial crisis, $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there, pretty soon you're talking real money, right? I mean, these are vast amounts of capital that need to be found from somewhere, and that people have to, there will have to be a return on that capital, or it won't be forthcoming. And that's one. And then, so size is important. And then the other point is inequality is important. And it is just staggering when you look at the differences around the world in terms of energy use. I mean, again, if you look at, compare the United States, say, to Nigeria. So, I mean, it's very interesting to compare the production with the consumption. So, production per head in the United States is the US produces about twice as much oil per head as Nigeria. It uses 10 times as much. So that's, there's a staggering inequality there. Everyone in the US on average uses, I think it's about 7 tons of oil per year, and in Nigeria they use about 700 kilos of oil per year. As a vast inequality. Again, just when you're thinking about access to energy, 1.3, I mean, I can't remember, you're talking about India, but across the world, the number is 1.3 billion people don't have access to electricity, and 2.6 billion people still using, as I say, traditional biomass with those very serious and unpleasant effects that's got. Which I guess all adds up to saying that it's I don't want to be excessively pessimistic. Again, I'm like Jeremy, a lot of the conclusions I feel are quite downbeat, but I think it's important to be realistic. It's a very hard job to move it. It's slow and difficult work, and there's a tremendous inertia in the world's energy system, and anything people want to do to set about changing it has to face up to those realities.
Yeah, I also think one of the issues that's really key in all this is that if we think about the highest carbon producers in terms of fuels and I don't consider biomass to be renewable. It's actually a very high carbon producer. But if we start thinking about that, we will see those associated with the poorest countries, which means they have even more of an impetus to mine that and to milk that. I think about the conversations taking place right now in Ecuador, where there's a spot in Ecuador that is the most biodiverse place on the planet. Ecuador has enormous oil reserves, and so a lot of the questions that have arisen are, should the world be paying Ecuador to keep the oil in the ground? And I heard the president of Ecuador a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about the fact that he wants to educate his people. He wants to sort of build better housing for his people. He's taking the oil out of the ground.
Yeah, that's right. As you say, they shopped it around, didn't they? They said to the world, would you like to pay us to keep this oil in the ground? The world said, no, actually, we don't.
Well, actually, they were up until the financial crisis. I think that was the plan. The Germans pulled out finally, and that's what scuttled the whole deal. But that was a kind of incredibly optimistic, utopian kind of project. People were paying them to keep oil in the ground. I mean, I thought that was kind of extraordinary.
Can I ask, and this is sort of, I think your citation of numbers and kind of this scale pulls a couple things together, particularly that consumption production number you said, almost reversed between U.S. and Nigeria. But we seem to talk a little bit differently about, this goes to your moral question, we talk differently about it when we're talking about oil. This building existed literally explicitly because of oil, and we can trace it, and so we can talk about it in certain terms. Is that different than talking just about wealth generally? I mean, is it easier to talk about excesses in wealth and regulating them than it is to somehow make this more abstract connection to energy?
No, I mean, I think that's a very good point. I mean, did you say energy is money? I mean,
yeah,
they are pretty.
Yeah, and there's economists who will argue that too, that almost literally you can track growth in wealth. It's been done best in U.S. to not just amounts of energy, but and they mean it in primary production terms, the efficiency of conversion of energy into work.
Which is why political action on energy is difficult, because for the same reason that political action on money is difficult, right? It's the same thing. They are, essential interests.
Well, you could kind of substitute, like if you had a big picture of the world's oil consumption, and then you wanted to replace the image of oil with economic, benefits and sort of who has the most, they'd probably be pretty parallel. I mean, the places that consume the most per capita would be, and tell me if I'm wrong, I'm right? That oil is money. They're kind of the same thing.
So that took the wind out of things, but but I think, but let me turn it back around, because I think your question about do we stop ourselves from thinking when we make it into a moral question? I was trying to shift it to say we have a certain moral commentary on wealth, and at the same time that
well, if our interest is in money, like if we all want to get richer and we all want more money, which seems to be the case, right? No, I mean, that's it. That's true. What's wrong with that? We all want to be rich. So if we all want to be rich, then it's not a question of oil bad or good. It's a question of what's the other opportunity. How are you going to replace the most valuable resource on the planet, give or take, with something else? And it's not just a question of how do you run your car or how do you, replace it in all of its various uses. How do you find something that has the same economic value as a barrel of oil? Like
Yeah, and indeed. I mean, so maybe one answer is, to an extent, it's information. And this is quite an interesting trend you're seeing a bit in the United States now, which is this idea about young people not owning cars, maybe not driving as much as they used to. People would rather, sit at home, and obviously you can be social through social media rather than driving out to things. You can shop online, et cetera, that to an extent the power of information is eroding the power of oil. But it's at the margin still. It's quite a small thing.
But it goes to, I think you use the figure we like to hear, we cite all the time, the number of whatever it is, man hours in a barrel of oil, right? That at the end of the day, what we're talking about is people doing things. And it is so easy in buildings to say somebody had to put stone on stone or make steel and raise steel up so that one can see the work present in buildings and in the excesses of buildings. In fact, you could argue that architecture is itself a luxury, right? So the more luxury you have, the more architecture you have.
Yeah. I mean, I think that to go back to that comment, yeah, I mean, if everyone wants to be wealthier and richer, yeah, but there's a kind of finite pool of stuff out there, and in fact,
99% of people want to be wealthy and richer.
Yeah, sure.
I mean,
sure.
And those who don't are either religiously enlightened or they're already wealthy.
But
I mean, truly.
What I'm trying to say is that you can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. Like the question of limits will return. Whether the limits are not oil, there will be some other to do with food security or water or something else. So like they're kind of limits.
The thing that is not limited is the human imagination and human ingenuity, right? I mean, we can keep advancing in that way.
But I think the point that I was trying to get at is to say, coal is different from oil. Coal is not that much transformed. Oil exists in all kinds of different forms that you can follow it from your clothes to your whatever it is. So it has a different underlying pattern. And what I try to highlight is the ways in which these patterns have inscribed them in our daily life, including advertisement, including the lifestyles that we are taught to adhere to, including busing from schools, et cetera, et cetera. And in order to really do the 5,000-pound life, I think we have to take into account what kind of a revolution it took to write oil into this, to write it out of our cities. So it's not the question of oil being good or bad. It's that way that it happened. But in order to make change, you have to be aware of how broadly spread and ingrained it is. You can't just turn a little screw on one building and it'll change something. That's not going to happen.
I think, and you're running through that history. I mean, I always value a certain amount of the history of this transformation because it has been so radical. And so that when we're looking forward, thinking, well, yes, it's tremendously terrifying and there's all kinds of problems on the way. But on the other hand, we've been changing radically for 100 years. Why, we're just going to have to keep continuing. And it is odd the degree to which we hold on to things just the way they are at the same time that we embrace this myth of our embrace of change.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why cultural production is so important as well, because it's exactly the thing that helps to shape those myths. And if one of the myths is kind of having an endless appetite for more, then that's a myth, and we can change that as well. I don't think it's something intrinsic in human nature.